Hello, everyone. My name is Bill Coughlin, and welcome to First Person Civil War Podcast, which retells the stories of the soldiers and officers on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. Episode 28 is entitled First Lieutenant James Dinkins in the 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion at the First Battle of Collierville, and relies on his book 1861 to 1865 by an Old Johnny, Personal Recollections and Experiences in the Confederate Army, which he published in 1897. James Dinkins, throughout his book, referred to himself as the Little Confederate, and aptly so. He lived in Canton, Mississippi, when in 1860, at 15 years old, his parents sent him to the North Carolina Military Institute. The school, located in Charlotte, was established in 1858 and meant to serve in the same capacity of other military academies like the Virginia Military Institute. At the outbreak of the war, the North Carolina Military Institute provided its cadets to serve as drill instructors to the regiments forming at Raleigh. Though they wanted to serve in a regiment, Cadet Dinkins and others could not initially enlist. By order of the president of the Institute, Major Daniel Harvey Hill. Major Hill announced to the cadets that the school would close, and those who desired to enlist must obtain consent of their parents. The cadets, full of patriotism and with the inspiration of youth, rushed to his banner. The little cadet from Mississippi caught the enthusiasm, but could not hope for permission to join the army. Several cadets urged James Dinkins to finally write to his father for permission, and he agreed. At the age of 16, James Dinkins and the cadets from the North Carolina Military Institute were attached to the 1st North Carolina, marched to the Virginia Peninsula, and fought in the Battle of Big Bethel on 10 June 1861, one of the first battles of the war. After the Battle of First Bull Run, which they did not participate, the cadets as a fighting force disbanded, and they dispersed to regiments that aligned to their home states. James Dinkins became a private in the 18th Mississippi and fought in the Peninsula Campaign through Fredericksburg. Following the Battle of Fredericksburg, Private Dinkins reported to the Confederate Secretary of War, where he received a commission as a lieutenant, dated 9 April 1863, and he returned to his home state, where he spent time with his family on furlough. First Lieutenant Dinkins was assigned to Company C of the 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion, in Brigadier General James R. Chalmers' Cavalry Brigade, which resided in northern Mississippi. In the wake of the Confederate victory at Chickamauga, they besieged the Union Army of the Cumberland in Chattanooga, Tennessee. To send cavalry in support of the siege from Mississippi to Chattanooga, General Joseph E. Johnston, overall Confederate commander in the West, ordered Brigadier General Chalmers in October to organize an expedition as a diversion. On the afternoon of the 3rd instant, I received orders from General Johnston through Major General Lee, meaning Stephen D. Lee, commanding cavalry in Mississippi, to move my whole command against the enemy on the line of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad within 4 days. The principal object of the move being explained to be to divert the attention of the enemy from the movement of General Lee was about to make in person a different direction. Brigadier General Chalmers would take his cavalry brigade and the brigade of Colonel R. V. Richardson on a raid north into Tennessee. To increase the potential success of the raid, he also incorporated some deception that caused the Union Army to divert forces away from his intended area of operations around the railroad line. Brigadier General Chalmers provided scant details in his report, but First Lieutenant Dinkins, who seemed to have a degree of rapport with Brigadier General Chalmers, expounds on the deception. A few weeks before we camped at Moss's Hill, a man reported to General Chalmers offering his services as a spy. He had good references from several Confederate generals, including General Price. He claimed that he would be able to enter the enemy's lines at will, having a paper from General Hurlbut passing him at all times. He made several trips into Memphis, but the information he brought back amounted to nothing. He gave his name as Pearson. General Chalmers was suspicious of him and decided to deceive him as to the point he intended to attack on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. He therefore told him that he would move against Corinth. He includes some back and forth between Brigadier General Chalmers and Pearson about movement and strength of troops, and then continues. Pearson left us with this information on his mind. He had ample time to advise General Hurlbut, which he did, as events proved. First Lieutenant Dinkins and the 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion, along with the rest of Brigadier General Chalmers' brigade, headquartered in Holly Springs, Mississippi. As Colonel Richardson's brigade marched from New Albany to Holly Springs, the general discovered a Union brigade encamped along the Clearwater River on a road between Holly Springs and Grand Junction, Tennessee. First Lieutenant Dinkins in the 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion, alongside the 7th Tennessee Cavalry and the 3rd Mississippi State Cavalry, were sent to attack this force. A Union brigade under the command of Colonel McCrillis was encamped along the river and was caught unawares when the 7th Tennessee Cavalry and the 3rd Mississippi State Cavalry attacked from the south, while First Lieutenant Dinkins and the 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion flanked and hit them from the north. On 6 October 1863, Colonel McCrillis's brigade held their ground and repulsed several advances made by the Confederates. Major General Hurlbut, on the same day, sent reinforcements to Colonel McCrillis and reported to Major General Sherman. The movement, if a real attack, will be on LaGrange and Moscow, an adjacent town. If this is a feint, they will, if in a sufficient force, strike for Pocahontas. The town of Pocahontas, Tennessee, is closer to Corinth, Mississippi, than it is to Memphis, and though his reports don't officially state it, Major General Hurlbut was anticipating the Confederates to continue marching toward Corinth, and shifted forces to meet Brigadier General Chalmers in that direction. Even Colonel McCrillis's brigade received a dispatch that the Confederates were headed toward LaGrange, which was northeast of their position, and he moved his force to that town by midnight of the 7th. With Union forces concentrating along the railroad to the north and east of his headquarters at Holly Springs, the Confederate deception seemed to be successful. Brigadier General Chalmers left a detachment to observe the movements of Colonel McCrillis's brigade. After further maneuvering and skirmishing in the vicinity of LaGrange, Brigadier General Chalmers's 2 cavalry brigades made for Collierville. On the morning of 11 October 1863, Brigadier General Chalmers's cavalry force of approximately 2,500 men arrived at Collierville, Tennessee. Collierville, during the Civil War, was a stop along the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. On the north side of the tracks was an ammunition depot and a fort, manned by 240 men from the 66th Indiana, and commanded by Colonel DeWitt C. Anthony. The Confederate plan was to cut the rail line east and west of Collierville, surround the fort, and force the occupants to surrender, but this plan did not come to fruition. First Lieutenant Dinkins and the 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion formed in the center of the assaulting force, moving up from the south. We arrived within 2 miles of the station about daylight. Our advance guard captured the Yankee outpost, and, as soon as the prisoners were turned over, made a dash at the inner guards, who, however, discovered our men in time to escape and give the alarm. We moved forward at a gallop. Colonel McGurk, with the 3rd Mississippi, was ordered to go in the rear of the fort and attack from that point, while the balance of the command would advance from the south. Though the Union pickets south of the fort were alerted to the Confederates' presence, the encampment north of the fort was not. The 3rd Mississippi Cavalry proceeded to raid the camp, and here discipline broke down. First Lieutenant Dinkins, the 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion, and the entire Southern force were in position. But with no sign of the 3rd Mississippi State Cavalry to the north, they did not press the attack. We formed line and moved through the woods to a point about 400 yards from the fort, and waited for McGurk. Our skirmish line was hotly engaged. General Chalmers, growing impatient, sent Lieutenant Banks to order the 3rd Mississippi to attack. A moment afterward, a long train of freight cars rolled into the station from Memphis, from which the 13th Regulars disembarked and ran into the fort. We knew, of course, that Major Cousins had failed to cut the road on the west, as ordered. Otherwise, the train could not have passed him. The time was approximately noon, and the train that arrived at Collierville carried 260 men of the 13th U.S. Infantry. But there were also many staff officers, as they accompanied their commander, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. Colonel Anthony of the 66th Indiana reported that his pickets had that moment been either captured or driven in by a large force of Confederate cavalry. I directed the regulars to get off the cars and the train to the back of the depot. A flag of truce was seen approaching from the direction of the enemy, and Colonel Anthony, who met it, sent me word that General Chalmers had sent his adjutant to demand the surrender of the place. I instructed him to return an emphatic negation, and at once made preparations to resist the attack. Having given his reply to Brigadier General Chalmers, Major General Sherman arrayed his small force of 500 men around the depot and the fort, which utilized railroad cuts as makeshift earthworks, and prepared for the assault of the Confederates 5 times their own size. These were disposed 3 companies of the regulars in the ditch outside a small earthwork near the depot, and the balance in the woods near the railroad cut, to the east and south of the fort. 1 company of the 66th Indiana was inside the fort, 1 in the depot building, and the balance outside in the wood to the west and south, and in rifle pits behind the fort near their regimental camp. Though still not in contact with the 3rd Mississippi State Cavalry to the north, First Lieutenant Dinkins, the 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion, and the entire Southern force began the attack. General Chalmers knew that any further delay would be ruinous, and, therefore, gave the order to charge. Our men moved forward in fine style, but were met by a hot fire. They charged within about 60 yards of the fort. We could see nothing of the enemy except the top of their heads. Besides a numerical superiority, the Confederates also had artillery on the field, which Major General Sherman and the Union force had no answer. The enemy at once opened with artillery from a ridge overlooking our entire position, throwing canister, 6-pounder round shot, and rifled solid projectiles. They also threw a few shells at us, but their artillery fire was principally aimed at our train, disabling a locomotive and damaging some cars. While First Lieutenant Dinkins and the 18th Mississippi Cavalry Battalion continued pressing in the center, the cavalry on the wings fell on the flanks of the fort and depot, but Major General Sherman and his makeshift force continued to fight. 2 columns passed the railroad on either side of us. A pretty brisk fire of small arms was kept up for a couple of hours, the enemy approaching under the cover of the ground, woods, and depot building within 75 yards of the fort. But at no time did he attempt to assault the fort. We had no artillery, and had to confine our attention to the defense of the fort, depot building containing the supplies of the garrison, and our own train. In this, we succeeded. Though a superior force, even without the 3rd Mississippi State Cavalry, First Lieutenant Dinkins and the rest of the Confederate force departed without attempting to take the fort. The 3rd Mississippi State Cavalry finally received word to withdraw, and rode in view of the enemy still in the fort and depot. With the train being abandoned, the men managed to make off with much of the personal baggage of Major General Sherman and his staff. It took some time for the men to examine whose accoutrements they now had possession of, but by that time it was too late for First Lieutenant Dinkins and the Confederate force to make another attempt on the fort. Through the baggage taken from the cars, we discovered that General Sherman and staff were passengers on the train. We captured all of their personal baggage. As soon as we ascertained that General Sherman was in the fort, the failure was doubly regretted. Brigadier General Chalmers stated in his report that Major General Sherman was present at the battle, but even he most likely did not know about this critical piece of information until after the battle as well. Keep in mind that it was Colonel Anthony, commander of the 66th Indiana, who received the flag of truce, and not Major General Sherman. Herein lies a great what-if of the Civil War. Had the 66th Indiana and the 13th U.S. Infantry not put up such a dogged fight against a vastly superior force, Brigadier General Chalmers may have assessed that his men could take the fort. If they were successful in this endeavor, they would have unwittingly captured Major General Sherman. This being before the Battle of Chattanooga, the Atlanta Campaign, his march to the sea, and the Carolinas Campaign. Major General Hurlbut, upon hearing of the fight at Collierville, immediately redistributed his forces to best counter Confederate movements, which led to 2 more engagements over the next 2 days, after which time the Confederates, low on ammunition, withdrew from the region. Major General Sherman personally commended the 13th U.S. Infantry, who served as his guard for about a year by the First Battle of Collierville. Having survived his close call, he continued on to Chattanooga, Tennessee. James Dinkins remained in the 18th Mississippi Cavalry until the end of the war. By the late 1800s, he, like many men after the war, decided to write down his experiences, mostly for his friends and family to read, more than anyone else. I knew then, as I know now, that sketches, papers, reminiscences, and volumes, almost ad infinitum, meaning to infinity, had been written and published until the reading people had become wearied, if not surfeited, with that class of literature. And he continues, "Yet those friends and comrades who read the MSS," he does not explain what this means, "advised me with one accord, and some even urged me, to continue and complete the sketches, and when completed, give them to the public in a volume, assuring me that they would be interesting to the public." Thank you for listening to the 28th episode. The link to First Lieutenant Dinkins' book is now available on the podcast website, firstpersoncivilwarpodcast.com. On Facebook, Instagram, X, and LinkedIn this week, You will find a picture of James Dinkins as a cadet, about 15 years of age, and as a first lieutenant in 1864, at the age of 19. The podcast received one donation this past week. Your kindness is greatly appreciated. Though James Dinkins was not wrong in saying that sketches, papers, reminiscences, and volumes written by Civil War veterans are almost ad infinitum, I have decided to alter the production schedule of the podcast. I will publish one episode every other week. The length and quality of each episode will not change, only its frequency. Thank you for your understanding. This means that in 2 weeks' time, Captain Lemuel A. Abbott of Company D, 10th Vermont, provides next episode's first-person account at the Third Battle of Winchester. My name is Bill Coughlin, and thank you for listening to First Person Civil War Podcast.